You hear it before you see it. That's what Silas Croft told his son years later. Not the way a man tells a story at a dinner table. The way a man tells it when his hands won't stop shaking. It starts like thunder in the distance. Like a storm moving in from the northwest, rolling across the plains the way storms had rolled across them for 10,000 years before the settlers came. But this wasn't thunder. This was a sound that didn't have a name yet. Listen to it. Close your eyes. Imagine you're standing in your field in Nebraska in the summer of 1874. It's July 20th. The wheat is tall. The corn is promising. You've got cattle in the south pasture and a wife who's tired but holding. You've got neighbors a few miles out, and you've got enough faith in God and yourself to believe the next harvest might actually sustain you. And then you hear it. A buzzing, but not like a bee. Not like grasshoppers in August. This is something bigger. Something that sounds like every electrical storm that ever existed was condensing into a single living roar. Like a freight train made of wings. Like the sky was tearing open and something ancient was climbing through. Silas Croft was a practical man. Third-generation settler. He didn't believe in omens or signs. He believed in what he could touch. His hands were calloused. His back ached from honest work. He'd seen droughts that killed cattle and winters that killed men. He'd seen crop failure and disease, but he'd never heard a sound like that. He stopped what he was doing. He was mending fence on the north line, and he looked up. The sky was still blue. That's what made it so terrible. The sun was still there. The clouds were still far off. But the sound was getting closer, growing louder. The birds had stopped singing 5 minutes ago, and Silas had noticed it the way you notice silence when you're used to it. All the songbirds, gone, fled, like they knew something. He started walking toward the house, not running. Silas Croft wasn't a man who ran, but faster than a walk. His wife, Margaret, was on the porch with their youngest, Thomas. He was 4 years old. She'd come out to see what the noise was. Storm coming? She called out. He didn't answer. He was counting the minutes, the way a carpenter counts measurements. How long until it arrived? The sound grew. The sound never stopped growing. That was the thing nobody could explain later. It wasn't a sound that crested and faded. It was a sound that kept ascending, like someone was slowly turning up the volume on something with no maximum setting. A roar of grasshoppers times a million more. Then the light changed. Not the way the light changes when a cloud passes over the sun. That's gradual, gentle. This was like someone was drawing a veil across the day. The sun was still visible through the murk, but it looked sick, bruised. The sky turned a color that nobody had names for, a greenish black, like a storm cloud had been dipped in ink. The temperature dropped like someone had thrown open a cellar door. And then the shadow covered the land. One moment, Silas could see the tree line 3 miles off. The next, the world was twilight. Margaret screamed, Thomas cried, and the sky came down. Not like rain, not like hail. Like the sky itself had weight and substance, and it was falling in a solid, undulating mass. The first ones hit the house with a tick-tick like someone throwing sand against the walls. Within seconds, it was a roar, a torrent, a deluge of living things. They were flying, landing, crawling, piling on top of each other until they formed drifts. Locusts, not a swarm. That word doesn't capture it. A cloud, an ocean, a plague. Some men who lived through it said the cloud was over 1 mile high, 2 miles in some places, 1,800 miles long, stretching from Canada to Texas. Some said it was the biggest swarm ever recorded in human history. Standing there, watching them fall out of the sky, Silas Croft didn't think about history. He thought about survival. The landing took 45 minutes. That's not an estimate. That's what the people who counted it later said. 45 minutes of insects hitting the ground like sleet. The sound was apocalyptic. The crackling and chittering, the clicking of 10 billion pairs of mandibles, the rain-like patter of their bodies hitting roofs and fences and the earth itself. It was like standing next to a wildfire, but the fire was alive. Silas pushed Margaret and Thomas inside and slammed the door. The windows were covered almost immediately. There was no light from outside anymore, except what filtered through the gaps around the doorframe. It was, for all practical purposes, the middle of the night at noon, and they kept coming. "Don't open the door," Silas said. Margaret was already looking around wildly for something to block the gaps, to keep them out, because they were getting in. You could hear them crawling along the walls, finding cracks, squeezing through. They were in the house, in the rafters, in the corners. Thomas was crying, not like a child, like something injured. Margaret started pulling all the curtains down, stuffing them into the gaps. Silas grabbed a blanket from the bed and wedged it under the door. The crickets, the locusts were everywhere now, on the furniture, crawling over the walls. The sound of them chewing was constant, a wet, crunching sound that made your teeth ache. Outside, the devastation was total. The crops, the wheat and corn that Silas had spent 4 months coaxing out of the soil were gone in 20 minutes. The locusts landed on the plants and ate from the roots up. They stripped stalks bare. They consumed entire fields like they'd never existed. Silas's neighbor, a man named John Harriet, watched his entire year's harvest disappear in the time it took to brew a pot of coffee. He just stood there afterward, staring at the bare brown ground where his crops had been. He never spoke much after that day, but the crops were the least of it. In the pasture, the locusts swarmed the cattle. The animals panicked, thrashing, bellowing. The insects crawled into their mouths, their noses, their eyes. The cattle's eyes went wild with fear and pain. Some of them broke through the fences and ran, crashing through the landscape with locusts covering their hides like a second skin. Some just stood there, paralyzed by the sensory horror of it. One cow was found 3 days later, still alive, but completely blind. The locusts had eaten out her eyes. But even that wasn't the worst part. The Jacobson family had sheep, good wool, worth money. That afternoon, with the insects still falling from the sky, Mrs. Jacobson heard a sound from the pen that she'd never heard before. Not the normal bleating, something else, something broken. When it was finally clear, the sheep were naked. The locusts had eaten the wool right off them, not just nibbled at it, consumed it, sheared them in the space of a few hours. The animals stood there pink and raw looking, huddled together, making sounds that didn't seem like they could come from living things. They were exposed to the sun, exposed to the insects still landing on them, exposed to their own exposed skin. Most of the sheep died within days from infection. The locusts didn't eat just organic matter. They ate everything. Margaret's laundry was hanging on the line behind the house. A dress she'd worn for 6 years. A work shirt, aprons, all of it gone. Consumed. She watched from the window, risking the door open for just a moment, as the insects devoured the fabric like it was the most nutritious thing they'd ever tasted. They ate cloth. They ate leather. They ate wood. In the barn, Silas found something that made his jaw clench. His shovel. The handle was hollowed out. The locusts had gnawed it, hollowed the wood from the inside because they craved the salt from his sweat, from handling it day after day. The insects had bitten the wood because they wanted the trace minerals that a working man leaves behind on his tools. That's when Silas understood. They were trying to eat him. Not directly, not yet, but they wanted what he was made of. The sound god, the sound that was the worst part. After the first few hours, your mind stopped registering it as a single noise. It became the ambient horror of existence. 10 billion mandibles chewing, 8 billion legs scraping against wood and stone and flesh. It was a sound that lived inside your skull, and it never stopped, not for 3 days. Men started to break. There's a name for what happens when the human mind is subjected to unrelenting sensory assault. When there's no respite, no moment of silence. When you can't rest because the sound is always there, and the insects are always moving, and the destruction is continuing even while you're trying to sleep. Some men got sick. Some just sat and stared. Some went into their barns and didn't come out for days. One man, a settler named William Morse, was found 4 days into the plague standing in his field, swinging a shovel at the insects that had already moved on. He kept swinging it long after they'd gone. His wife said he never spoke again, just swung the shovel and stared at nothing. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical destruction. Neighbors stopped visiting. They couldn't face each other because each face was a mirror of hopelessness. Margaret begged Silas to pray, to do something. But prayer felt like a word spoken into an empty well. There was no God in the sky that July. There was only the sound. Stop for a second. I want you to think about something. You're standing in your field. It's the middle of the day, but it's darker than dusk. The ground is covered with insects. They're in your house, eating the clothes you own, eating the furniture you built. Your cattle are blind and dying. Your crops are gone. Your wool is gone. Your neighbors are losing their minds. The sound never stops. It's been 3 days, and you haven't slept because you can still hear them crawling, chewing, multiplying. Your children are asking you when it's going to end. You have no answer. Everything you've built for 4 years is gone in 4 hours. Now ask yourself, if you were standing there with your livelihood vanishing inside 1 billion tiny mouths, with your children crying from hunger and confusion and the pure animal terror of it, would you have the courage to try something insane? Or would you have surrendered like the rest? Would you have prayed and hoped and waited for God or the weather or something to save you? Ask yourself that question, because Silas Croft didn't surrender. By the 4th day, every farmer within 100 miles had tried something. Some men took their guns and stood in the fields, shooting at the swarm. The sound of their rifles was thin and useless against the roar. They hit thousands of insects. Thousands of insects fell dead, and the swarm didn't notice. It was like firing a pistol at the ocean and expecting the tide to stop. Others lit fires. Great big bonfires meant to drive the insects back. The smoke rose into the murk, and for a moment, maybe a few of the insects moved away from the flames. But the insects adapted. They moved around the smoke. They flew over it. They came from the sides where the smoke wasn't. The fires were just another obstacle in their path. Some men beat pots. They banged on metal and screamed and tried to intimidate the insects into leaving. It was the sound of men going mad with helplessness. The locusts didn't care. By the end of the 4th day, even the most stubborn settlers had accepted their reality. There was no weapon against this. No gun, no fire. No amount of human noise or fury could stop what was happening. This wasn't a plague you could fight. This was a force of nature. And nature, as any man of the frontier knew, was indifferent to your desperation. But Silas Croft was not a man who accepted indifference. He'd spent those 4 days watching the insects. While other men prayed or shot or burned, Silas watched. He observed. He noticed things. He noticed the black slime. Everywhere, the locusts landed and died and piled up. They left behind a thick, oily residue. It coated the ground. It clung to the insects' bodies. It was a combination of their secretions and the oils from their crushed bodies and the heat from their decay. It looked like tar. It smelled like corruption. A sharp, almost chemical stench that made your eyes water. And the insects, the living ones, they didn't like landing in it. When the drifts got thick enough, when that black slime built up, the new locusts would try to avoid it. They'd skim over it, looking for bare ground. They didn't want to sink into that oily death that their predecessors had created. That's when Silas stopped looking for a weapon. He started looking for a trap. On the evening of the fourth day, he went to work. Not with a gun, not with fire, with scrap metal and old wood and coal tar, the thick, black, viscous residue that accumulated from burning coal. It was a material he had access to because he'd been burning coal for heat since the winter before. He'd saved the tar, saved it without knowing why. Now he knew. The first hopper dozer was crude. That's the only honest word for it. It was a frame made from old fence posts and scrap lumber, maybe 10 feet long and 4 feet wide. On the bottom, he'd installed a series of angled boards, like the teeth of a rake that had been flattened out. The whole thing was designed to be pulled by a horse, though Silas's horse was spooked half to death and barely willing to cooperate. And under that frame, he painted coal tar. Thick, sticky, disgusting. The idea was simple. The locusts would land on the moving boards. They'd be stunned briefly by the motion. And before they could jump away, they'd sink into the tar and die. It was a machine built on the principle of mass death. His neighbors laughed. They came by the next morning to see what Silas was building. And when they understood what he was trying to do, they laughed, and not kindly. There was an edge to it, the edge that comes when men are watching another man try something so obviously stupid that it's painful to witness. "You're wasting good tar," old John Kelsey said. "When this is over, and it will be over, God permitting, you're going to wish you hadn't wasted your materials on this foolishness. The Lord will provide," Mrs. Patterson said, her hands clasped in prayer, her eyes closed as if she were already communing with heaven. Silas didn't argue. He didn't have the energy. He just kept building, because he'd noticed something else. These people were praying because they had no other options. They were helpless, and helplessness is a spiritual matter. When you're backed into a corner and there's nothing left but faith, then faith is all you have. But Silas had an option. It was covered in coal tar and looked like something a desperate man would build at midnight while his sanity was hanging by a thread. Still, it was an option. He finished the machine on the morning of July 25th. The swarm was still there, still feeding, still destroying, still producing that endless, mind-breaking sound. The temperature under the cloud had dropped another 10 degrees. It was like living inside an endless twilight. Margaret watched from the porch as Silas hitched his reluctant horse to the frame. "Will it work?" she asked. He looked at her, really looked at her, saw the exhaustion in her face, saw the fear, saw that she was holding on by the thinnest possible thread. "I don't know," he said, "but at least we'll know we tried." The first pass across the north field was a revelation of horror. The machine rolled forward, the frame jolting over the ground. The locusts on the field, billions of them, clustered in the stubble of what used to be wheat, barely registered its approach. They scattered, some jumping, some flying, some just crawling out of the way. But the bottom of the frame, with its angled boards and sticky tar, caught thousands of them. They stuck. They writhed. The sound changed. It became a different kind of crackling, more frantic, like insects in their death throes. The tar held them. It was so thick, so viscous, that once they made contact, they couldn't escape. Their legs got tangled, their mandibles got clogged. Some of them suffocated in the sticky mass. Others died from the heat of compression, the friction of their own bodies piling on top of each other in that black morass. When Silas pulled the machine back to refill the tar and scrape off the accumulated bodies, the frame was covered in dead insects. A layer of gray chitin and amber body fluid and the black tar all mixed together into something that looked like a sculptor's nightmare. The smell was unspeakable. It was sweet and rotten and chemical, all at once. The smell of insect bodies decomposing in the heat, the smell of coal tar, and the oily residue of their crushed bodies. It was a stench that made you gag, that made your eyes water, that made you understand, viscerally, that you were engaged in something primal and filthy. But it was working. The second pass, third pass, fourth Silas pushed the machine across his field for hours. The horse slipped constantly on the layers of crushed insects and tar. Its hooves would slide out from under it, and Silas would have to stop and wait for the animal to regain its footing. His boots were caked with the black slime. His hands were covered in it. The smell was getting into his clothes, his hair, his skin, like it was seeping into him through osmosis. But the locusts were dying. Not all of them. The swarm was too vast, the plague too comprehensive. But in the path of the hopper-dozer, there was a difference. The ground was clearing. The feeding insects were being killed faster than new ones could replace them. It was a war of attrition, and Silas was winning it slowly, inch by inch, section by section. Other farmers watched. Some of them came back the next day with crude versions of their own. The hopper-dozer spread like wildfire through the agricultural settlements of Nebraska. Men who'd been praying for divine intervention suddenly found themselves building tar traps and crawling through fields covered in dead insects. But Silas's hopper-dozer was different because he'd kept building it. While other men were satisfied with a single pass, Silas made pass after pass. 12 passes across his field on the first day, 15 on the second. He worked until his hands were raw. He worked until he couldn't see straight from the accumulated fatigue and a constant assault on his senses. Margaret brought him water at noon and again at dusk. She'd wrap cloth around her face to filter the stench. Thomas watched from the house, seeing his father transform into something other than human. A thing covered in black slime and insect parts and suffering, but doing something. The mechanical sound of the hopper-dozer, the grinding of wood on bone, the scrape of metal on chitin became another constant in their lives, the sound of fighting back. On the 5th day of the plague, Silas's field had a visible difference. The insects in his north pasture were visibly thinner. The ground was still covered, but it wasn't the undulating mass it had been. The locusts still ate anything green, but there was less to eat because Silas had already destroyed most of his remaining crops, clearing the insects. He didn't care. Crops could regrow. You can't fight locusts with wheat stalks. You fight them with filth and determination. By the 7th day, the change was undeniable. Silas's farm was starting to look different from the surrounding devastation. It was still covered in the black tar and the dead insects. It was still horrifying to look at, but it was his. He'd carved out a section of land that was, if not reclaimed, then at least contested. He'd drawn a line and said, "This much, at least, I will not surrender." The work was nauseating. The smell was soul-breaking. His horse had gone half-mad from stress and wouldn't cooperate without constant reassurance. But it was working, and that was enough. On the morning of July 29th, the sound changed. Silas had been awake since before dawn. He hadn't really slept much in 9 days, and he heard it. The constant roar and crackle and chitter of the swarm was still there, but it was different. Thinner, less urgent. The sound of a locomotive that was moving away rather than approaching. He went outside. The sky was lighter. Not light exactly, but lighter. The bruised, sick green black was fading into something closer to dark gray. The wind had shifted. He could feel it on his face, a wind from the southwest that was pushing the cloud away. The locusts were lifting. They were taking flight. The swarm was moving. Not because they were defeated, not because Silas had beaten them, but because they'd finished. They'd consumed what they came to consume. Their biological imperative was fulfilled. The cloud that had risen in the north was now heading south. toward Kansas and Oklahoma and Texas, carrying the hunger to fresh fields, to fresh crops, to fresh devastation. The wind grew stronger. By midday, the sky was blue again. Not the blue of a normal July day, but close enough. You could see the sun again. Shapes more than a few hundred feet away became visible. The constant assault on the senses, that unrelenting roar, stopped. The silence was terrifying. After 9 days of that sound, the absence of it felt like an assault in its own right. Silas stood in his field, covered in tar and insect parts, and sweat and human exhaustion, and he didn't know what to do with the quiet. His mind kept waiting for the sound to return. Part of him expected it to come back. It seemed impossible that something that powerful could just leave, but it had. He looked around at what remained. His farm was a devastated brown island in a sea of total devastation. The insects were gone, but they'd left their mark. The crops were gone. The fields were bare. The ground was stained with tar and sticky with death. But there were sections, the sections he'd cleared with the hopper dozer, where you could at least see the land again. In the surrounding farms, there was nothing but ruin. John Harriet's field was a wasteland. Mrs. Jacobson's naked sheep had mostly died by then. William Morse, the man who'd been swinging his shovel at empty air, was still swinging it, even though the insects had been gone for hours. But Silas's farm, it was marked. It was marked by the tar, by the filth, by the machinery of mass death he built and operated for 9 days straight, by the price he'd paid in sleep, in sanity, in the dignity of a man who'd been reduced to killing insects in bulk. He stood in the middle of his field and realized something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Survival doesn't care about dignity. It doesn't care if you're clean or dirty, noble or base, proud or broken. It doesn't reward the man who prayed harder or believed more sincerely or faced the horror with greater courage. It rewards the man who is willing to get filthy, the man who is willing to do the job that nobody else wanted to do, the man who is willing to cover himself in tar and insect parts and the evidence of his own desperate ingenuity. Over the next weeks, as the full extent of the plague became known, the hopper dozer became legend on the frontier. Farmers from Nebraska to Colorado started building versions. They all looked different, some larger, some with different mechanisms, but they all operated on the same principle. Use their own broken bodies against them. Use tar and friction and momentum to kill them in bulk. It was the most effective defense against the locusts that humanity had developed. And it was born from a moment of absolute desperation in a field in Nebraska. The historical records would later focus on the mechanics of the hopper dozer, the engineering, the innovation. Men would be celebrated as inventors and visionaries for adapting and improving the design. But they'd forget something. They'd forget Silas Croft, covered in tar on a July morning, his eyes red from exhaustion, his lungs full of the stench of dead insects, his mind barely holding together, building something that looked like madness, because sanity had proven to be another word for surrender. They'd forget that the hopper dozer was born from filth, from getting your hands dirty, literally, from being willing to engage in work that was beneath you, from doing the job nobody else would do because everybody else was too proud, too clean, too devoted to their image of themselves. Silas Croft would live another 47 years. He'd rebuild his farm. The crops would come back. His children would grow and have children of their own. The locust plague would become a story that got told and retold and eventually simplified into a history lesson about pest control and agricultural innovation. But Silas would remember the silence when the swarm left. He'd remember the tar under his fingernails that took 3 months to clean out completely. He'd remember the smell, a smell that was so specific, so tied to that moment of existential horror, that he'd encounter it one more time 30 years later, and his hands would shake for an hour. And he'd remember that he'd survived, not because he was brave, not because he was lucky, Not because God was watching, but because he was willing to do something stupid, something filthy, something that nobody else wanted to do. He survived because survival, on the frontier, isn't about being noble or clean or beautiful in your struggle. It's about being willing to get your hands dirty. The 1874 Rocky Mountain locust plague killed more crops and livestock than any other natural disaster in American history. The economic damage would be equivalent to billions today. Entire families were bankrupted. Some of them committed suicide. Others just disappeared into the landscape, broken by what they'd witnessed. The locusts came again 2 years later, in 1876, and again in 1877. The plague would recur sporadically for 2 decades. But the hopperdozer, that filthy, brilliant, tar-covered machine that Silas Croft built on desperation and genius, became the model for fighting back. Men who'd been reduced to prayer and helplessness suddenly had an option. They had a tool. They had a way to fight. And fighting even when it's filthy, even when it's desperate, even when the odds are against you fighting, is better than surrender. History remembers the shiny heroes, the generals who looked good on horseback, the politicians who made grand speeches, the philosophers who theorized about survival and virtue. But history forgets the men covered in tar and insect blood. It forgets the engineers who built machines out of desperation. It forgets the farmers who were willing to look ridiculous in front of their neighbors, willing to do the job that everybody else considered impossible, willing to sacrifice their dignity and their cleanliness and their sense of who they were in order to survive another season. But we remember them. We remember Silas Croft standing in his field on a July morning, covered in the evidence of his own ingenuity and desperation. We remember the men who got filthy so their families could eat. We remember that survival on the frontier wasn't about being noble or clean. It was about being willing to do the job nobody else wanted to do. If you want to hear the stories that built this nation in blood and mud and tar and insect death, if you want to remember the grit and the filth and the desperate innovation that kept this country moving forward when nature was trying to stop it, subscribe. Do it for Silas. Do it for the memory of men who were willing to get filthy so that we could be here. Do it because history forgets them, but we don't have to. Subscribe